Cool. Let's start with your book. So, Romance of Reality. I know you're doing a follow-on book that we talked about, but let's just talk about the Romance of Reality, why you decided to sit down and write a book and tell the world about X. What is that? What is X, and why is that important? And what did you want to kind of relay?
Yeah, so I think there were multiple goals. Like one thing was just to write a book about the evolution of life and explain those mechanisms and how life emerges from an inanimate planet and how intelligence and consciousness emerges from the evolutionary process.
Right.
And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about that process and whether intelligence was something that was really improbable or something that a evolving biosphere would produce almost inevitably if it's evolving.
Right.
And a lot of people had argued for different reasons. Some were kind of like ideological and cultural reasons,
Right.
but they were arguing that life was rare and that intelligence was probably also rare. And so humans, or human-like intelligence, shouldn't be expected on other planets. And if this is the case, there are all these kind of practical implications about that, like specific scientific questions that if that were right, that would give you an answer for. And if it's not right, it would be a really important thing because, for example, a lot of people are interested in the question of, are there aliens? Are there intelligent beings like us out there somewhere in the universe?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really cool, like, kind of philosophical question, but it's real. I mean, at this stage in our technology, like, you know, we're probing the universe. We have tools to maybe allow us to detect these types of things. And so that's a real question that we can ask right now, that we have to ask like a scientist, and it's just curious people. And so, yeah, so if that's not right, and if intelligence is actually something that's probable given a biosphere that evolves over billions of years,
Right.
then that would tell us questions like, are we alone?
Right.
But also it might have some spiritual significance. The reason that there were these different camps was that a lot of these people who saw consciousness and intelligence as something that was inevitably produced by, you know, the universe, the laws of physics, and, you know, the evolutionary dynamics that emerge from those laws. The people who usually favored this idea that life was kind of built into the design saw some sort of spiritual significance to it usually.
Right.
And so the camp that was pushing back against that, it wasn't like they were just putting out a scientific theory. A lot of them were people who felt like, hey, supernatural views are religious views, and then there's science and atheism, and the idea that reality has no meaning or purpose. That's kind of the scientific stance, and we need to protect that. And that kind of biased some of those people towards different theories that may or may not be true, because they thought, okay, if the universe doesn't have a design or a meaning or a purpose, and everything's basically just random,
Right.
then, you know, it seems that consciousness would be something that would be highly improbable, or even life. And so the book is basically showing that it seems that when you look at the big picture and all the details, so it's kind of like this kind of like micro and macro view at once. If you kind of look at all of the evidence, it seems to point to a universe that does generate life and intelligence and consciousness. And then those phenomena are not trivial in the way that there's just, you know, all these things that exist in the world, and that they're equally kind of like, you know, random products of these random processes. No, it seems that life and intelligence actually might have the ability to influence the large-scale development and evolution of the universe. So we already start to see how we can potentially expand to other planets if the growth of complexity and intelligence is something that happens inevitably, but it's also something that happens at this exponential rate, then basically the way that intelligence is going to increase is something that like we can't really grasp, because we tend to think linearly. We don't think exponentially. So it's hard for us to imagine exponential technology growth, exponential increases in intelligence. And when you do understand that and you see this trajectory, whether, when I say life, it's not just life, it's how life is going to be influenced by our technology. When you see this trajectory, then you start to see a picture of life being this phenomenon that we can call adaptive complexity. So living systems have been more, I guess, technically defined as complex adaptive systems. So you can think of life as a whole as a phenomenon called adaptive complexity. Then you see it just is this thing that just is inevitably learning all of the time from the challenges that nature presents it. And because it's always learning and always adapting, its expansion seems inevitable. When you start to look at all of these details of the evolutionary process, and you understand that it's this knowledge creation process, and this process where life is becoming increasingly robust and resilient and better at solving all of our existential and technological challenges, then you see there seems to be this trajectory that people like Ray Kurzweil, famous technologist who's the director of engineering at Google right now. So he's written a book called The Singularity is Near, which kind of motivated this whole like transhumanism movement that was around before him, but he was a big part of really showing how this idea is a scientific idea. Then you get this picture of the universe becoming more complex over time, of intelligence spreading and of consciousness spreading.
Right.
And when you see that, then you're like, wow, the story that science is showing me is actually pretty spiritual, however you look at it, because it seems like life is fundamentally part of this grand trajectory.
Yeah.
And so the book is basically showing the details of how evolution creates information, because that's what life really is. We're these information processing systems. We're kind of like these biological computers. We're not just like computers. We're not just machines, because we're also conscious. We have experiences, and our consciousness allows us to do all these interesting things. Like we can run simulations of our future, and we can imagine new inventions, and we can bring those inventions into reality. And then those inventions help us expand and manipulate the world around us in more powerful ways. And when you understand that, you're like, okay, there absolutely does seem to be like something like a design.
Right.
The old idea that everything's random, because you could imagine the universe being this random system of gas particles, and it's just, there's no structure. There are lots of ways that you could tweak the parameters of the universe, like the laws of physics and the constants of nature. You tweak those things even just a little bit, and you'll get a universe with no life, and really a universe with no real structure at all. Like you tweak the force of gravity slightly, you tweak like the strong or weak nuclear forces, and you get a universe with nothing.
Our definition of nothing.
Okay, yeah. So, well,
You know what I mean?
we don't completely know.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, so it gets really deep, because it's called the fine tuning problem. So what it shows though is that in some cases it's literally nothing, because the universe just expands so fast that it doesn't contract to form matter. So if there's no matter, there's going to be nothing at all. But someone might say, okay, if you change it a little bit, if you change one of these parameters a little bit, you get like a universe with nothing. But is there some sort of sweet combination out there that exists that we don't know about that might give you a different form of life? Okay. Maybe. Right. Maybe, but so really, like, at some point we might get so advanced where we basically have a simulation and we have all of these parameters and we're tweaking them in every possible way and seeing what kind of universe they give rise to. But for the most part, this whole fine-tuning thing, which came to light in the 70s and was really influential and had a lot of physicists thinking like maybe there is a designer, and like people like Paul Davies, very respected physicists, writing books called like The Mind of God, because there seems to be this design that gives rise to life and consciousness and a universe that grows increasingly complex and filled with life. But then atheists came along and they were like, no, we probably live in a multiverse. So you're seeing the selection effect. Most universes are probably lifeless, and they probably do have these different configurations of parameters. And that means the universe is mostly structureless and meaningless. But in certain pockets of the universe, you will get this little bit of interesting transient complexity. And that's what life is. So there we've explained away your fine-tuning problem. And for a lot of people, that was that was enough. Like they were like, okay, yeah, that's the answer. Life's not special. It doesn't have a design. It's just kind of an illusion because we find ourselves to be in one little place in the whole multiverse. But the multiverse theory leads to things that might even be weirder than the idea that our universe is some sort of creation by an intelligent agent. For example, it says, okay, there's probably this massive number of universes, maybe an infinite number of universes. So every possibility that you can think of, and every weird predicament that you can think of exists somewhere out there. And so then you're like, okay, that's the option. We explain away a creator by this theory that gives us every weird ass possibility we can ever conjure up, pretty much. And so it's not an answered question, but what my book is trying to argue is not that there's a creator necessarily, but that there's a design and there's this trajectory, and that we have to explain that, whether it's a multiverse explanation or it's a creator, or this third option that I talk about in the book, that there's universes that can basically replicate themselves, and that there's this evolutionary process at the level of universes that might mirror Darwinian evolution on our biosphere, and that would progressively lead to universes that produce life, and then life that spreads and becomes increasingly complex. So we don't know what the answer is, but if you accept that story, that there is this appearance of a design and that life does have this significance in this universe that does need to be explained, that's a very different story than saying everything's random and that life is doomed and we're this transient phenomenon that's going to come and go and never influence the universe. So
yeah, we talked about this for 2 hours straight and went over that stuff. I agree with some stuff. I just like so if you're going to say that there's a design, that implies some sort of incentive, because you need to be incentivized to make a design look like whatever that is, right? So I guess fine.
Not necessarily. So you could have a design that just emerges. So basically this third option, so you have, maybe it's God, maybe it's multiverse, and then I mentioned this third thing. So it's called cosmological natural selection. And this idea is that universes, when black holes form in those universes, will create a black hole. So a black hole is like, it's a singularity in space and time, and the Big Bang is a singularity as well. And we actually came up with the Big Bang theory because we understood that general relativity predicted black holes, and then we found evidence that black holes were real. And then we were like, well, if the universe is expanding and we trace it back to its origin, it implies some sort of singularity at the beginning of time. So what the cosmologist Lee Smolin argues is that when a black hole forms in our universe, it's actually a Big Bang event that births a new universe. And then so you have this process where universes are basically reproducing. And then you can have a universe that gives rise to life. And if you have a universe that produces intelligent life, technologically advanced life, capable of someday engineering black holes that produce other life-bearing universes, then you have this mechanism, or suddenly you have a process that leads to universes that create things that create more universes.
Okay.
And so then you could have a universe that's somewhere far along in that chain of that process
Yeah.
that looks completely designed and is designed in a way it's been designed, but it's been designed by an evolutionary process.
Right. So I see. So I can't get there personally. I think there's a lot of I think we can't get past a lot of our human innate things in our DNA, like pattern recognition and allocating cycles to things. I don't prescribe to the multiverse, and this one too has a cycle. And the unfortunate thing about what we're trying to accomplish here is like with the cycle, we need to say, okay, because we can infer that like our universe was created by a black hole in another universe, but we need to have an origin, we need to have a genesis somewhere, and that's where I struggle. And so the fact that we can identify a genesis, no matter how many layers of the onion we add,
Yes,
scares me. And it says, why are we even just we need to stop with the cycle thing. So that's my so am I wrong to assume that?
no, I think that's fair. And like epistemologically, so like, you know, epistemology is kind of the study of knowledge and how we know what we know and how we can sort of validate our beliefs. And so I use that word because I think it's an important one that people should start thinking about. There's this whole field of epistemology that thinks about justification and like, you know, how should we reason?
Right.
Is science superior? Like some people might go, oh, I believe in a religion. Like I think my religion is just justified, equally justified to your scientific explanations. And then you would want to, you know, have a field of logic or reasoning that kind of tries to get to the bottom of what we're justified in thinking. So you might think that, you know, so you made a few different arguments. One is that maybe we're being kind of anthropomorphic and biased by, you know, we have these patterns in the human world and then we project those patterns onto nature and that can lead us astray. And I think we definitely can do that. And that is a problem. I'm not sure if that's what's going on here, because if reality has these cycles and that's the way things are, and when you say cycles, there's different models that involve cycles. So for example, Roger Penrose thinks that the universe is like you have this event where you have this big bang and then you have this expansion, but then eventually basically it's a cyclical model where it contracts and then gives rise to another expansion. And so I just saw an article come out today that's like, and it was probably about Roger Penrose, but it was like Nobel Prize winning physicist argues that the Big Bang wasn't the beginning. So there are cyclical models. That goes back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche said he had this idea of like eternal return or eternal recurrence. And you saw that in the philosophy in True Detective. Matthew McConaughey's character had this part where he explains how he thinks like time is just this cyclical thing and that everything that's already happened kind of is playing over again. And it's kind of disturbing because if that's so, then it's like, how does something have meaning if it's just this infinite cycle? I don't think that that's the way I think about reality. I do think there are these cycles, but I think it's this continuous cycle of creating new things, new emergences, so that a universe is created and then it potentially gives rise to other universes. And there's this branching to where, or you might not even think that it involves multiverses. You might think, okay, there's just this universe and it's expanding, but that life is spreading and that knowledge can continue forever and that novelty and pattern can come into the world forever. So some people believe that the heat-death hypothesis has been challenged by a lot of really respected scientists. However reality is, I do see these cycles, but these cycles are part of this kind of creative tendency of nature to create these complex adaptive systems, and these systems give rise to new systems. And so I see the process as something infinitely creative. And to me, that has spiritual connotations. It just makes me think about existence differently. And then when you see the universe as creative, it's really a step away from seeing God in that creative process. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a creator. But if there were, let's say we found out the universe was designed and has a creator. To me, it's not necessarily an unscientific idea, because the simulation theory is a similar theory that our universe is created. So, but
Yeah.
what it's doing is it is adding more layers to the onion, like you said.
Yes.
And some people will say, well, you're just passing the buck back because it doesn't answer the question. The real question is, how do you get something from nothing? Like, what started it all? And you're just complicating it. And if you're doing that and you're not answering something, why do I need your theory? Because I don't need to assume anything about these extra universes. So my answer to that is, we have a fine-tuning problem. We do see the universe does, in the book, that's what I argue, is that it's growing increasingly complex and it's not this arbitrary thing. So we're faced with a fact that we need to explain that requires us to go outside the system. We have to think about, why is it such that if you tweak these parameters, you get a universe with nothing in it? Does it mean that there are other universes? If this is the only one, that would seem completely improbable, that the only universe that exists happens to be this range of parameters that is the one that's very, Stephen Hawking, everybody has talked about how if you change these parameters by even a hair, that it'll give you a lifeless universe. Not only that, when we look for the parameters based on just mathematics, what you would expect, some of these parameters have very strange values, way different than what was predicted, based on sort of a null hypothesis, a sort of just arbitrary universe, just that it's kind of this random system. So there are questions there that make us go, maybe the onion has more layers, and I think that's really important to discuss, and it might shed some light on things inside this universe if we start thinking about, like, is there a design? It could bring people spiritual comfort if they find out, oh, we're part of this larger process and this process is creative. But does it answer that ultimate question? No, I'm not sure it does, and that is a problem. But what I would say is, certain people, I think Joe Shabak, the artificial intelligence researcher, might have said something like this, and I might be getting it wrong. So if so, I apologize, and would like clarification from him in the future. But other people have said something similar. Some people have made the argument that maybe nothingness, a state of nothing, is inherently unstable, and that we just assume that this state of absence of everything is kind of the way things should be by default. And we can imagine that. And it certainly seems like that would be, kind of like there's these in physics, the principle of least action and stuff. It would seem like nothing would be the default state.
Right.
But if you have this, there seems to also be this essence of reality, that if reality is kind of like, if you grant that reality exists and then you grant an existence to nothing, it seems like you have to have something to even have a concept of nothing. So then you're kind of come around the loop to a universe where something exists could be just as natural as nothing.
Right. To find nothing, because nothing is not, like, when people say nothing in this context, I'm assuming a lot of viewers are thinking nothing is like a void, but a void is something. So we're really talking about really nothing. I'm like, no time, no matter, no space, nothing even to that would go into. That is a void of that, a void of a void. So, right. That's what it should be, but it's not. And that's why I'm giving even like a little tiny percentage of like, to you with this theory. I just like, I'm under the impression it should be nothing, but it is not only not nothing, it's something with complex life that is capable of reflecting on that something, which we're doing right now, which is crazy.
Yes, it is crazy. And it could be something, you could have something, but it's something totally uninteresting, like a universe without life. And we could also find ourselves in a universe, and thousands of years ago, we didn't know what the answer to this was, but you could imagine that we were in a universe where the laws do just simply don't allow any chance for life to get off the planet.
Yeah.
Like, it could be a universe where life is just this little insignificant speck, and for a long time we thought it was.
Yeah.
But if we're not insignificant and life inevitably spreads, and I'm not saying that our civilization has to succeed, if life is this thing that the laws of nature are basically generating at different areas of the universe, then statistically, and if it works according to this process that I've been describing, where life is adapting to the world around it and it's actually becoming better at manipulating the world and more robust and resilient, so it's really, really hard to kill, then statistically it's inevitable that life at some point spreads, if you buy the whole argument in my book, of course. And this wasn't my argument. This is me synthesizing all this work that, everything's, there's probably like 1,000 different books and papers cited, all by respected academics. Yeah, if you find it hard to believe that we're at this stage of technology where we're spreading out into space and we're starting to change the structure of the cosmos, then you have to say, okay, there's something, okay, that's pretty weird. Oh, and it's not just this arbitrary thing. There seems to be this sort of significance for life and consciousness, that it's kind of affecting the world around it more than the other stuff. Like rocks, inanimate life, not like inanimate material is never going to get off the planet. Sarah Walker, who is like an astrophysicist who became an origin of life researcher, she talks about anti-accretion. And so what this word means is that on Earth, you're seeing accretion is when gravity pulls stuff in from space, like a massive body is pulling stuff in because there's a gravitational force. So
accretion is responsible for the organization of what we know today after the Big Bang, essentially. Yeah.
Yes. So like planets forming and things being pulled in. So we understand that, and that's what happens in the inanimate world.
Yeah.
But if you see anti-accretion, so if you see something coming off of a planet, like a satellite that goes into space, and then goes into orbit, that's a biosignature for life. You go, oh shit, there's dynamics there. There's something going on there.
Yeah.
That would not ever happen in an inanimate universe, and it seems to violate the laws of physics. That was one big thing people used to debate like a couple hundred years ago. Like, is life supernatural? Does it violate the laws of physics? In a way, it does. But
it doesn't violate physics. It violates the theme of physics. That it happened at the point of the Big Bang into now. And if that theme is anti-accretion, was what you're saying, if that theme is broken, then we can assume some stuff. Yeah.
Yes, it violates physics of the inanimate world, like so the physics that we knew. But then we need to go, okay, how does life work? And then we start analyzing life, and we see that life has this genetic code, and then with the in genes and stuff, you have all these different molecules, you have proteins, and you have nucleotides, and then those things are little material things, you could say, and then they're moving according to all of these physical laws and forces. So there's physics there, but there's also information. And then so you have to expand the definition of physics to include computational theory, to include biology, and then agency. And agency is basically when you see living things moving with these goals. You don't see rocks, you don't see chairs moving in that way. It's a new type of dynamic that emerges with life. It's related to information. So it's not supernatural, but it's something that we didn't account for before. We don't understand with our current paradigm. So it'll appear supernatural, but really it's just new dynamics and new laws that we need to understand. But it's also something new where you're like, okay, that changes how I think about the nature of reality a bit. Oh, so back to anti-accretion. So with life, and with life that progresses towards intelligence, you will see this process, and that's showing that life has this cosmic significance. Let me give one more example quickly, because Ray Kurzweil gave this example in a book I recently read, and this AI researcher from Harvard named Alex Wisner-Gross, who has a great TED Talk, he also gave this example. He was like, imagine the Earth, and imagine you're like an alien civilization, like watching the Earth. Yeah. And like, let's say they've been watching it for like 100,000 years, or however long you want to imagine. Right. You see all these like comets, like, meteors hitting the Earth, asteroids, and that's like a normal thing that happens from time to time. And maybe it was part of the dinosaurs going extinct, but at some point, corresponding to our year, around like 2020, 2030, they're watching the Earth and they're seeing something going towards it, a big asteroid. And then suddenly you see this anti-accretion of something hits it, and then that thing gets destroyed. And then it's like, those aliens have to ask, what is going on that planet that there was this sudden change in causality and in physical interactions and in cosmic events too. And it's like, oh, there was life, there was biology, there was information, all this got built up. And then it's this system that's trying to continue its existence. It's trying to save itself, and it just blew up a comet. So life is very different. There's a change in causality in nature that has to be explained. And it fits into this bigger picture of like the design of the universe, because you're like, oh, that's a little bit different than this picture of a random universe. And maybe life is just some froth, like Stephen Hawking called it, chemical scum. And it's a very different picture. And so if you're convinced that it's not our luck that we're here, that it's kind of this natural progression, then you're like, okay, this is going to keep going.
Yeah.
This level of technology, everything we're experiencing, we're making a metaverse.
Yeah.
We're experiencing, we're learning how to use psychedelics to achieve these higher states of consciousness. All of that is just the beginning of what we can experience through technological and, ethical and moral progression in all forms. But so it's not just this cold idea of like, life spreading as sort of these like self-reproducing machines and just taking over the world. It's literally this story of everything is going to get more magical, deeper, richer experiences. And so the future is just this mind-blowing place that we can barely fathom right now. And again, that's a very different story than the old picture that life is insignificant and we're doomed.
I don't think life is insignificant, but I also don't. So you were on Rogan and you described I think you guys differed from Neil deGrasse in like the fact that we're not interesting. I don't think I don't agree completely with Neil deGrasse Tyson, but I also do think we're insignificant because those aliens you mentioned watching us, I don't think they would be watching us. I think they would be aware of us, but I think if we extrapolate our civilization into millions of years, which is crazy to do, because if you look at the number of years it took for us to get to this point where we can talk about this and share it with the world, and then you extrapolate that millions of years from now, I think we'll have an understanding of physics where life is not special in our eyes anymore. It's just a part of the universe. Just as a star is being born or a supernova is happening, life is on a planet. And I think that's the same physical or physics-based fact in terms of significance, one-to-one to an alien millions of years from now. So I think in that respect, I don't think life is significant. I think it's all over the place, as we discussed, and you know my opinion on that. But I also think it's kind of a little bit insignificant, and just that it's just here, and aliens that are that complex and innovative and way ahead of us will just know that this is the way that it is. That's how I feel, but I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, it's really reasonable. And I definitely agree that, in some ways you can say that we are like stars. Like that's kind of the point of the book. We're part of this cosmic evolution process, and the stars were an essential part of producing life because basically what stars did through stellar fusion was create the higher elements. And so life couldn't have emerged if stars didn't first emerge. And Carl Sagan has this famous quote, "We are star stuff." But
he also said we are we're the universe knowing or something.
Yeah, we are we are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Right. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah. So true. So in your picture, that's all true. It's very similar to mine. Okay. But at the same time, you see it as something natural, which is totally right. So you're saying life's not rare. No. It may be common. Life may flourish throughout the universe. I mean, it's obviously not everywhere, but you're right. I think making the argument where the conditions are right, it probably arises, and it's probably just too far away for us to have noticed yet, or maybe it's here and we don't know about it, because if they're so advanced and they don't want us to know, it would be very easy for us to not know. So yeah, there's all sorts of ideas about that. Where I would push back on what you're saying is, so David Deutsch, he's like the father of the quantum computer. Everybody's hearing about like how quantum computers are going to change the world. He basically came up with that theory trying to explain quantum mechanics, and then people took that theory and tried to turn it into something practical. But so really respected, smart physicist. He's kind of a maverick because he does go against the grain. But yeah, his kind of overriding theme is that knowledge has this special power to influence the world, and that life is basically embodied knowledge,
Yeah.
and that there are no limits to knowledge creation. And he has this new theory, this kind of new theory of everything, or kind of way to approach physics, is called constructor theory, where you try to understand what transformations of matter are and are not possible. But basically, he thinks that life is special because it's this system that is accumulating information about the world around it. It's modeling the world, and that allows it to start transforming the world around it.
Right.
And that a world without life won't have as many potential transformations or possible states as a world with life. And so, and Sarah Walker, who I mentioned earlier, always quotes David Deutsch, and it's a long quote, so I can't remember exactly how it goes, but he's basically makes the point that like the only things in the universe that can, you know, like produce like nuclei or something, it was like basically how I talked about stars creating like higher elements through like stellar fusion. Like humans have created synthetic elements. Like there's like humans can do what stars do, but he basically says like we're the only two things that can do that in the universe. And so it does kind of draw that equivalence that you were talking about. But I think he's trying to explain that life can engineer the universe in ways that like basically we're not insignificant. We're producing things that could only be produced by these massive cosmic objects. But more than that, life could potentially go on. So, you know, Elon Musk wants to put us on Mars, and you can imagine us terraforming Mars and putting a little biosphere on Mars eventually. And you can imagine us expanding outward. If we merge with our technology, we might not even need oxygen. Like
this is something we both agree on, which is the social organism, I think, is what you're getting at.
Yeah, like the planet being kind of a social organism or a global brain or something.
The drive of humanity, I think, is I think we agree with this, is just that it keeps going. I mean, we attacked the Earth. We attacked, well, before that, we attacked the, let's just say, continent, that whatever tribe was in that, and then we did the Earth, and now we're moving on to the universe. And it's just that societal life form that you kind of described on Rogan, in the like, just it keeps going, it keeps innovating, and I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, and something I didn't mention that I always forget to mention that might not be obvious to people is your brain is a network of neurons, and consciousness emerges from that.
Right.
Where this network of intelligent agents on the Earth that are exchanging information through our devices in a very similar way to neurons exchanging information. So there could potentially be consciousness that emerges at the level of a social organism, like at the level of this global brain. And if that's true, and we spread to Mars, so let's say we spread to other planets, and we're hooked up through, you know, information technologies where we're exchanging information as fast as can be done with the laws of physics. Then you can see this brain, this social intelligence spreading throughout the universe, and transforming the universe into this kind of larger information network. And so when you say that, you know, life could be out there, like, you know, that it's the universe is kind of plentiful with life, but that it's just like a star. My only pushback would be stars have a predictable like lifespan that we can count on, and it's going to influence the universe in this specific way, where with life there's really no end to how much it can transform the cosmos. It can, there's
an incentive with life. There's no incentive with a star.
Yes, so that incentive is part of agency, and it comes from The fact that the evolutionary process kind of pumps information into us from the environment. Basically, we're modeling the world around us. And then we want to continue our persistence. We have this desire to survive, and then we form these social networks, and then there's almost a collective desire for the species to survive. And so it keeps going. And if that's the case, then life would have literal, not like subjective significance, because someone can be like, oh, well, it just depends on how you look at it. We're significant, but like, you know, that's because I choose, you know, to look at my life as having a purpose and making a difference. But in objective reality, we're not really significant. What I'm arguing is that we could be part of this evolution of the universe where it's organizing itself, and us spreading is part of this larger organization process. And we're actually transforming the world into an intelligent organism, into some sort of cosmic mind.
I see.
That might be the final goal.
You're saying agency from biological civilizations or biological agents, and that agency that is with those, that in itself is an element added to the universe that is going to transform itself, the universe itself.
Yes, totally. So it's if you break everything down, there's not anything new there, as far as like, you're not going to find something that's not, you know, part of the physical world.
Oh, but
when those elements are arranged in a certain way, you get patterns that encode information.
Yeah.
And then when you have information, you're encoding information about the world, you're starting to have a simulation of the world around you. And then that simulation starts to model itself and look on, you know, reflect on itself, and you have consciousness and self-consciousness. And that seems to allow life to have greater agency. So now we can think about things, and we can think about how to get off the planet. And so it does seem to be an essential part of the evolutionary process. The evolutionary process gives rise to the emergence of agents and information. And this creates some sort of self-preserving tendency that then spreads through the universe.
Self-preserving, and the need to propagate. And then on top of that, there's an aspect of discovery and innovation that is added to the human race specifically because we've ascended into the intelligence realm that can warrant that attribute being allocated to what we are. Because like if you look at ants and then giraffes and whatever animal, they're just trying to survive, and they haven't got to the natural selection scale where they've been prescribed intelligence to our point. When they do, they'll probably be gifted that attribute of like discovery and innovation, because we don't have an incentive to really go and look at why a star is doing a certain thing or what's on Mars. I mean, one could argue the tribe of humanity itself is trying to propagate into the stars or whatever, but I think there is a discovery thing where like we want to just journey out and be Columbus of the universe, and that happens at some point when an intelligence gets to a certain point. I think that's what we have, and that's also an added thing that you're
I think it's something new, but you could also say in some ways it comes from just this tendency to want to survive that all things have. But the difference is the only difference that I think is worth pointing out is that so things are trying to survive, and to survive you have to avoid threats and you have to get energy. So you have to get food for almost all of life. Some of life is able to feed off inorganic matter, but most life eats other life. It's called heterotrophy. So you have like autotrophic and heterotrophic organisms. But yeah, so life has to get energy. So we exist in this niche, or niche, British people say, and that's our environment. And so for a lot of simple organisms, they're getting by just fine. The difference with humanity is that we start to create these new niches, these like social niches. And then for anyone who is willing to take on greater complexity, there's opportunities for those people. But if you want to live a simple life and you want to, let's say you're in a small rural conservative town and you have just like the Christian worldview is a good worldview for you, helps you make good decisions on a, good practical life decisions, and it gives you a little social network. You're
Yeah.
kind of like the ant. You might not go outside um, your little niche,
Yeah.
but for people, but because there's this whole universe filled with energy and opportunities,
Yeah.
there's always a new niche for anyone who wants to take on a more complex model of the world and wants to venture outward. So I'm not sure that ants are going to evolve into a higher intelligence because they're doing fine in their niche. And you could see us as ants that have evolved to this higher intelligence. I mean, when I say that, I don't mean as ants, but I mean, if evolution is right, if Darwin's big idea was right, we're all life and we're all branches from this original
Right.
lineage,
Right.
and we're just occupying different niches. So in that way, humans aren't that much different than other life. You could say, oh, we're the same. We're like ants, we're like all the other species, except the crucial difference is we're the species with the most intelligence. So
Right.
we have this ability to expand outward that we wouldn't see with lower intelligences, but it's all the same entity. So
Yeah.
we need the bees, we need the ants. If we got rid of the bees tomorrow, we'd be gone. So it's like the whole biosphere can be looked at as an organism,
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay.
and that we're kind of the brain of that.
Yeah. And there's an average human too. So even I'll even go further down than what you mentioned with that royal family. There's tribes in South America who have never seen a person besides in their tribe and have no idea that cell phones exist, and they literally hunt with arrows still. And so if you take Elon Musk and you take like a boy in that tribe, and like it averages out, and you're saying that average keeps going up.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a statistical thing, and there's this drift. And there's an evolutionary biologist. He passed away from cancer at the end of the 21st century, but his name was Stephen Jay Gould, and he was really influential. And he didn't like this idea of progress because he thought it led to potential dangerous ideologies. And we could talk about that later if we want to, because like the Nazis kind of used this idea of progress and evolutionary progress to kind of justify this idea that there were inferior and superior races, which is totally not justified by the theory if you understand it all. Because as I just mentioned, everything's connected, so everything depends on each other. But yeah, he didn't like this idea of progress. Either he thought it could be used in that way, and that was bad, or it could be used maybe in some religious way, and he thought like it was showing a design, and that would lead people to religion and away from science and evolution or whatever. So there are different ideological reasons that people didn't like this idea of this continual progress and being, being part of this larger cosmic plan. But he was just saying that there is this like statistical tendency for things to get more complex, but it's this kind of random drift, and it's limited, and it's going to stop. Where I'm saying, because there's endless opportunity to create these new niches, and we actually have to expand outward if we want to survive as a species. One thing is when you become self-aware and you become intelligent at a certain level, you're able to see into the future. You become aware of your own mortality, and you become aware of the potential end of your species. So any intelligence across the universe that is at our level is going to realize we have a game clock. If we don't get off the planet before our sun explodes and dies, life is done. And so that creates a trajectory to expand outward. And so if that's the case, then this kind of inevitable kind of drift, this kind of statistical tendency towards higher complexity, it doesn't end. And then when you realize that, it seems like kind of like the universe is this thing that produces life, and life is sort of like an AI program, and it's presenting it challenges, and that life is continually learning from this, and it's just spreading and spreading. And then maybe it was kind of destined from the beginning that the universe was on this trajectory where life emerges and continues to spread, and that ultimately it could be such that the whole universe is becoming one integrated entity, an organism or a mind.
It's insane that race even exists, because at the end of the day, well, the universal day, at the 24th hour, the the universe is going to be stretched out because of expansion, so much so that matter itself does not exist, and there will be nothing. And so it's interesting.
So yeah, no. So that needs to be challenged, because
Okay.
I've seen a big think article that keeps being run, and it's like the universe is about to die for this reason, like we're on the last stage. And it's there's a really good reason to think that might not be the case. And they recently asked me to write for them, which is pretty cool. And I think I'm going to write an article on why that article isn't right. Actually, I have an article that's on this that I'm finishing right now for this website, Noema, that will be out. But it's challenging the heat death hypothesis. But what you're saying is a little bit different than the heat death hypothesis, because the heat death hypothesis is that the universe comes to this equilibrium.
Right.
And that's different than the universe expanding at such a fast rate that everything is just moves away from each other, and matter and energy becomes diluted to the point where there's nothing, basically. It's slightly different, but it's the same inevitable kind of nihilistic picture of everything ending. So
yeah,
we learned that so there's a theory that dark energy that's causing the accelerated expansion of the universe may be a substance that physicists have called quintessence. And basically, they found out that this increasing expansion driven by what we call dark energy sped up like 5 billion years ago. And we don't know why. It's not constant. We thought there was this cosmological constant where the rate of expansion would be steady. But for some reason that we don't understand, it just sped up. And it happens to be, and this is just something I'll throw in, I don't know if there's a connection, but I think this Physics World or Popular Physics article mentioned this too. So I thought it was just worth throwing out there in case someday this turns out to be a real connection. The universe started expanding at this faster rate suddenly around the time that life emerged on Earth. So who knows if there's a connection there, but for some reason it sped up.
So like 4.5 billion years ago ish.
Yeah, so it might not be exactly at the same time. I think this expansion, this increased rate of expansion, sped up like 5 billion years ago, and life on Earth is thought to have started 3.8 to 4.5 billion years ago. We don't know exactly when, but
okay.
So basically, physicists aren't sure that the rate of expansion is going to keep increasing. And this theory says that dark energy is this substance called quintessence, and it's this dynamic thing where the energy, the expansion rate speeds up, but at some threshold, it starts to slow down.
Right.
And so everything might not be getting away from everything else in the way you imagined. And, so Sean Carroll was interviewed in a Nature article about this idea of quintessence, and he was like, yeah, we're back to the old thing where we just absolutely have no idea about how the universe is going to end. So quintessence, some people said we could be back to where the universe contracts into a black hole, and then we have this like cyclical thing, or who knows, you have this big crunch. We don't know, but what I think the theory in my book could explain, which I'm going to talk about in the second book, and I feel weird saying my theory. It's not my theory. This theory that there's this kind of...
Your interpretation of multiple theories.
Yeah, and you could call it a cosmic teleology. There's this word from philosophy called teleology that says there's this kind of design to things, but and that life is significant, and that the universe is producing intelligent life, and that once intelligent life emerges, that it must spread forever, basically. So there's a book called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle that was great, and it was written in the 80s, and it was the first book really putting this theory that life's significant out there. But so I think maybe if the universe is this organism that's kind of evolving and emerging into this integrated, complex, adaptive system at the level of the universe, then maybe that points to like this theory of quintessence where the universe is like speeds up at like there's growth periods for an individual organism, and then maybe the growth slows, and it's kind of maintaining this sort of state of balance that would allow the whole system to become integrated. So I think that's where the universe is headed. There are different theories about, okay, even if it does reach this state of maximal complexity where it's this integrated kind of mind or organism, is that sustainable forever? What's next? There's a lot of different ideas. You could say, oh, it could give birth to new universes via this cosmological natural selection idea, or maybe that state is temporary and then it eventually dies, this like cosmic organism that emerges. Or maybe life can go on forever because the universe just slowly expands and life just keeps spreading, and it's just this thing that grows more complex over time. I don't know. But whatever that story is, whatever the reason is, that's a very different story than people like Brian Greene are putting out there, like with his new book, where he says, yeah, life is just going to come and go, and that the universe is just going to end. Everything's going to get so far apart that there's no like complexity or pattern in the world anymore. I don't think that's right.
And I don't, yeah, and to be clear, I don't want that to happen. I'm just, I really would not. Like, I want to die knowing that maybe that might not happen, and my long ancestors 1,000 times over are still in somewhere in the universe. But I'm just going off of physics, and like we know redshift is a thing, right? Light is stretched and through the universe, through its expansion and its accelerating expansion. So one could extrapolate that into the end of matter.
It's a completely reasonable thing, in that we definitely should have made that assumption. But yeah, the quintessence theory is really intriguing because it provides an explanation of why it's speeding up and when it could slow down. Because when we find out that fact, because when the universe started after the Big Bang, there's this reigning theory of cosmology called cosmic inflation, and that was a new picture too. But basically, the universe expanded at a really fast rate and was creating new matter. It actually kind of violates the first law of thermodynamics in a way it does, in a way it doesn't. But new matter was continuously being created during this period, and then that expansion slowed down. And that's all the theory predicted. It came out in like 1980. And at that time, we thought that the universe was going to contract, because we thought that the amount of matter in the universe was such that it would bring on this phase of contraction. Around 1999, late 90s, we found out that the universe is expanding. Like you said, you see this redshift, but that it was expanding faster and faster.
Yeah.
And then we go, okay, there must be something driving this expansion. And then we go, oh, there's this thing called dark energy. That's actually like the opposite of gravity. It's pushing things farther away from each other. And then so you didn't just have the initial cosmic inflation period. You had rapid inflation, and then it slowed, and then you had it speed up again. And then we call it dark energy. And we don't know if dark energy is different than what was causing cosmic inflation.
Yeah.
And but it seems like this thing called dark energy could be this dynamic thing where you can't just assume that it just keeps expanding forever, because it might slow down. And anyone could throw that out there. It might, but the reason it's an actual theory is because it predicts why the expansion sped up. And then that same reasoning, that same mathematics that gives you the reason that it sped up is also the thing that predicts that it will start to slow at some point.
The speeding up is what gets me, because you could say the Big Bang happened and it's a balloon that keeps expanding. But the fact that it expands faster 1 second than the second, that's faster, or in other words, acceleration, means that it's ignoring the physics of itself, which is don't go faster than the speed of light. It's going faster than the speed of light. Into what? So one must think, so it's either that it's beating out whatever it's going into, or whatever it's going into is evacuating for some reason, and it's letting the release or the expansion of the universe accelerate. But why is that happening? And you're saying dark energy has a part in that. Is it a part in that, or is it a symptom that we're seeing?
Yeah, We don't know what dark energy is. So when we say it, it's kind of like a placeholder name for whatever is causing that accelerating expansion. And you're right. That was one big surprise, is that space is expanding outward into whatever, I guess, void. I don't know. Like, it gets language gets tricky when you talk about it, but it is happening at a rate faster than the speed of light.
Yeah. And I think that fact right there surprised everybody in the field at the point when it happened, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, because we thought speed of light was this barrier that couldn't be passed. So yeah, it changed the physical picture. Acceleration on its own, if it's a steady acceleration, it could also be, natural too, because like you could have it expanding at a certain velocity, and acceleration is just like an increase in velocity. So you could still have a steady acceleration and it wouldn't be that weird. But the fact that the rate of acceleration is changing, it's not constant acceleration. That's the weird thing. Because when we found out about this expansion, we were like, oh, that was Einstein basically predicted that. And he had this idea of a cosmological constant that he had in his model. And he thought it was a mistake. And it turns out that something like that was needed. But yeah, then there was this finding, like, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or something, where we understood that the expansion wasn't at the steady rate. So there doesn't seem to be a cosmological constant. And that's what quintessence is about. It's saying it's not constant. It's this dynamic thing that changes behavior depending on the dynamics of the universe. I don't know exactly what, but yeah, so we don't know that everything is just going to just keep expanding like this balloon that doesn't stop. And I'm glad you bring that up and talk about it as potentially being this expanding balloon, because you can imagine that being this kind of an inanimate thing that's just process of doing that. But what I'm saying is, it may be something like an organism, and there may be more fine tuning and design to it than we realized. And maybe it's growing in the way that an organism does, that it somehow mirrors our development. And it sounds like a far out idea, but anybody interested in this, they should look up a paper called the Autodidactic Universe. And I think that basically means like a universe that is like self-learning and kind of self-perpetuating. But I don't remember exactly what it is, but that's the idea of this paper, is that the universe is this learning machine and evolution is this kind of like learning process, and that the whole universe is something like a complex adaptive system or a brain that's evolving. And that has Lee Smolin, a really respected cosmologist and author, and Jared Lanier. He's one of, big AI guys. The headline when that paper came out, websites, pop websites published it, and it was like, Microsoft researchers say the universe is a learning machine or a neural network or something. There were other papers by different physicists saying that the universe seemed to be something like a neural network, and that got coverage too. One last thing to mention, Sabine Hossenfelder, she's a really trusted name in physics. She's known for being very skeptical, but she wrote a pretty interesting speculative theory idea for this for Time magazine. And it was she was pointing out that the universe, its structure at the large scale looks very similar to a brain in the way things are connected and structured hierarchically. Like if you zoom out and you look at like the cosmic structure of how like galaxies are situated, you have solar systems nested inside galaxies, and these galaxies are connected by these cosmic filaments that look like neural synaptic connections. And she wonders whether the brain is, whether the universe is thinking.
I see.
And I don't think the universe is thinking, but I think what you're seeing is the infrastructure for the future state where life spreads and does transform the universe into this brain. And so what I'm arguing is this picture that I'm explaining of life becoming, life being significant in the universe, if it's true, it could answer all of these cosmological questions. The universe very well could be something like a brain or organism or a neural network. All of those things are kind of the same thing because they're networks of agents that are processing information. And I think the evidence points to something like that. And that just kind of leads. So it's very practical. It says, maybe all of these cosmic mysteries can be explained because the universe isn't just this arbitrary system where life has no significance and it's going towards this state of nothingness. Maybe it's actually forming this organism. But then you have like, well, why the hell is reality that way? You have all these spiritual implications. Like, was it designed? Is it somehow part of this grand plan or architecture of the universe?
Right.
We don't know, but if it's true, it makes things infinitely more exciting.
Oh yeah,
psychedelic. Yeah,
that definitely makes things more exciting. But then now what I was getting to earlier. Now we're prescribing an incentive to the universe itself, and that's interesting. I personally believe the only thing with an incentive is life. All of the universe, not only the Earth, but obviously there's an incentive. The only thing with an incentive in this universe is life and the want to propagate, which is interesting. And I think about that almost every day. But you're saying, yeah, this would do that. This would give that.
Yeah, you also said we're part of the universe. So if life has this incentive and life is just made of matter, then you're just saying that the universe does have an incentive in a way.
Yeah.
So
it's
this shift. It's this shift that you were basically you were getting at, that you've already had, that life is not anything different but nature. But then you seem to go back into this kind of dualistic thing where you're like, oh, well, nature doesn't have incentive, only life has an incentive.
Right.
But if nature is waking up through life, then maybe nature has the same kind of incentive that life has, and that projecting that and ascribing an incentive to the universe isn't like projecting something human onto the universe, and that what humans are is actually something that's part of nature. So when we're understanding what humanity is, we're really understanding what the cosmos is.
Right, because and you would need your thing would need to be right with the contraction, because if what you just said is correct, the universe would not want to break everything down to a fundamental quark and split a quark and everything be gone. It would have an opposite incentive, I think.
Yes. And it's interesting you're using, so I wouldn't use the word incentive usually either, but if you start to argue that it does have this tendency and trajectory, then you're not really saying something very much different than saying it has an incentive. So you're right there. But yes, I would argue that if you have this theory that you believe that, well, you don't believe, you would say that this theory is consistent with like a universe that's becoming fully integrated, like an organism, to where every point in space is kind of informationally connected to everything else. And that, yes, everything's not just getting farther apart. Like the dynamics of the universe have to support life's continued persistence.
Right.
So yeah, you could call it like a biocentric theory. There's a book called Biocentrism by this guy Robert Lanza, where he kind of makes this argument, but he kind of goes off the rails a little bit by saying that the world doesn't exist except inside our minds. And well, maybe he doesn't. Some of these people aren't fully consistent, but and yeah, it sells a lot of books when you say, like, you bring up the idea that consciousness is somehow creating everything. But I don't really go there. I don't like that, because this whole evolutionary process was going on long before life and brains and consciousness emerged. So I don't think we can say that consciousness creates reality, but consciousness definitely alters reality. It allows you to start, there's a change in causation in the universe to where you get these things called agents, and these agents are interested in their own continued persistence, and they can look into the future in their minds, they can simulate the future in their head, and then they can start making changes to the world that allows them to continue to persist.
Right.
If you believe that the universe is just this thing that's evolving from an inanimate state to this completely integrated state, then life is just the mechanism through which the universe wakes up.
Okay. Well, right. And are you saying the universe has that incentive, though, or are you just saying it just happened to wake up?
I'm saying that it's not random. Okay, so yeah, language gets interesting. So I'm saying if you probe this whole process, we're going to understand everything in a formalizable, mechanistic way that can be explained in mathematics.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's still the universe moving towards a very specific, maximally complex state that, based on the old view, people would go, oh, that's a highly improbable state to be in, because if you just think about statistical thermodynamics, then states move towards this state of complete disorder and chaos. And you're saying that the universe moves towards the state of complexity. That seems mystical. But then I would argue we didn't understand the thermodynamics of organized systems, because the original thermodynamics was based on systems that are called isolated systems and systems at equilibrium. So they're systems that basically don't have energy coming in from the outside. Like life is an open system. We have energy coming in from the sun. And far from equilibrium, which means when you have energy pushing a system away from the state of complete disorder and chaos, it's sort of, you get this different natural tendency towards self-organization and order. And so that's called non-equilibrium statistical thermodynamics. So if the universe isn't this system like the people who okay, so the second law of thermodynamics, and this will just be quick, but the second law of thermodynamics, when we were trying to understand that and trying to understand what's going on with systems like becoming disordered. So
Yeah.
imagine you drop a blob of ink into a glass of water. You're going to see that ink naturally disperse.
According to the gravitational pull of whatever planet you're on, yeah.
Yeah, but if you just put it in water, like a blob of ink, like you drop it in, I don't think it's gravitational forces in that case. It's just the molecules spreading out.
Well, if you drop an, I might have brought that up, and it might not have anything to do with what you just said. But if you like do that in space, that drop of ink is not going to go into that water. The ink goes down into the water because I think it's heavier than the water. But I don't know if this even matters to you.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah. So, okay, yeah. So that's important too, because the second law is really complicated, and it's this tendency towards disorder that you see with dynamical systems. So things that are free to all, like all the little components of the system are just moving around chaotically.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have objects and you have like planets in space, and they're not becoming more disordered. And if you have, if you have a glob of ink in space,
Yeah, if you have a glob of ink in space and you push, because you're going to have to push it, it's not going to fall to the water. If you push it towards the water, that blob, it's going to actually, what's going to happen is it's going to be a sphere. It's going to be a sphere of ink. And then I guess you're going to have a sphere of water, because you can't have a cup of water in space unless you pour it and then bring it to, I don't know. We're going to have a sphere of water, you have a sphere of ink, and it's just going to bounce off the sphere of water. I'm pretty sure. I don't think it's going to come out.
Yeah, I know those videos with like people in space like drinking like Tang and stuff, and it's like floating around. Like, so so that's interesting to think about, how the force of gravity is maybe an influence on this tendency towards disorder. But aside from liquids, I think at some so
I see what you're saying. You're talking in general.
And the reason the liquid in space might be doing that is because there are some sort of bonding forces that are keeping that from dispersing. But if you have a gas in space, the gas molecules are going to disperse.
Yeah.
So unless there's any forces holding it together, where it can be gravity or it could be something else, things that aren't bound tend to spread out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's so, but you're absolutely right. The second law of thermodynamics, when we're trying to understand this at a molecular level, this guy, Ludwig Boltzmann, to envision it, he was just imagining a gas in a box. And a gas, he imagined that first you have all these gas molecules in the corner, neatly arranged.
Yeah.
Let's say you start out with that initial condition. It doesn't have to start that way, but let's say you start with something complex.
Right.
Then naturally, if all those gas molecules are just moving around, it evolves to spread out throughout the whole thing. And then people took this idea and applied it to the universe and said, well, if the universe is an isolated system, then things must be spreading out according to this law. And then it gave people the wrong idea that everything was becoming more disordered. But actually, when you look at the history of the universe, there's organization is arising. You get the formations of planets and stars. And I'm arguing that with life, this process of complexity growth just keeps continuing. Anyway, the point is, for many systems, like inanimate systems, if the things aren't bound, there's this natural tendency for things to spread out. And you can demonstrate that with an ink blob, putting that in water. People use this example. I'm just not thinking of something totally random. And then it disperses, and you can see that dispersion. And it's very unlikely for the blob to reform. It'll probably never happen. According to the statistical thermodynamics, if you wait long enough, it could happen. It could reform, but it's so statistically unlikely because everything's just moving in random directions that it spreads out necessarily.
I see what you're saying.
So the big mystery was that, okay, then what's going on with life? If it's getting more complex, why isn't it following the second law of thermodynamics? What we found out was that, well, life is this kind of autocatalytic feedback loop where it's regenerating itself through chemical reactions. It's this self-sustaining system, and it's able to get energy from outside, from like sunlight. It gets stored in like, plants, and we eat those plants, or some animals eat those plants, and then we eat the animals that eat those plants. But basically, because we can extract energy from the outside, complexity can just keep growing.
Right.
So what changed things is when the universe was realized that, it was expanding at this accelerating rate, and it wasn't this static thing. Actually, when the second law of thermodynamics was invented, we didn't know whether the universe is, we had no idea it was expanding. We had no idea if it had a beginning or if it was there forever. It actually seemed like a religious idea to say there was a beginning.
Yeah. Right.
And really, Einstein had to be convinced by this priest, George Lemaitre, I think his name is. But basically, that seemed like a religious idea. So when the Big Bang that theory became prominent, the Catholic Church was like, that's the moment of creation. So like, because prior to that, a lot of people just assumed that the universe was just here forever. So my point is, if the universe is this static system that's just evolving like a gas in a box, you could imagine it just becoming increasingly disordered and chaotic. But we actually see this tendency towards greater and greater order. And the fact that the universe is expanding actually helps this creation of organization, because it doesn't need to come to equilibrium in the way that a system that was basically confined does. And it's always out of equilibrium since it's expanding, and this fact that it's out of equilibrium allows for the growth of increasing order. There's a book by a physicist named Julian Barber. It doesn't talk about life, but it talks about how we completely got it wrong, this idea that the universe is becoming more disordered, that the universe is becoming increasingly organized over time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really violate the original understanding of the second law of thermodynamics, because that was really just saying that energy is getting dispersed. It wasn't so much about disorder. That came later. That's a lot to get into, but I talk about that in the book. And yeah, basically the idea that the universe is growing more disordered is a big misunderstanding. It's one of the biggest misunderstandings in the history of science, because it's not right.
I don't know. I mean, in terms of more of mass accumulation, if that's what we want to define as order, then that's fine. But we also need to make sure we're not defining order as a human. And
yeah, that's a big problem too.
Yeah, to us, something's organized and disorganized, but we're just humans. We have nothing to do with. We have no idea what the standard is, right? I don't even know if there is a standard.
Well, what the book is arguing is that things are forming, and then those things basically, so you have these transitions where matter in the world, where its simplest components are organizing itself into more complex arrangements. So you have subatomic particles came together to form atoms. Then atoms came together to form molecules. And then on planets with life, molecules came together to form cells.
Yep.
Cells came together to form multicellular organisms. So multicellular organisms are kind of like superorganisms. We're communities of all these cells that are like individual agents themselves.
Yeah.
Then we form societies, and now we have this like global brain and this like global organism. So,
Okay.
and then all of those things are connected too. They're interconnected, and then they create this integrated network. So when I say the universe is growing more organized, and I like to use the word organized more than order.
Hmm.
For example, order, you can have a crystal that's not a lot. You know, crystal's this dead thing, and it's not that interesting. I mean, they're pretty, but it's just a repeating pattern. That's something that's very stable, but it's fixed.
Right.
But the organization we see with life isn't fixed in this one arrangement. It's this fluctuating system that has all these feedback loops, and it's constantly growing and regenerating. So it's a kind of functional organization. We're functional. We have all of this physiology that keeps us in homeostasis. And then the biosphere as a whole is kind of staying in this kind of homeostatic, stable state. So I do think we can define it that way. And the picture of the universe that I'm trying to propose is that the whole universe is growing more organized and more connected. And there's actually a different mathematical structure to it because it's networks of information are growing. And if the universe becomes this integrated thing, it's going to show a different sort of causality, a different sort of structure and a way of sending information from one part to the other than a purely inanimate universe.
Okay. I think I understand. And okay, so after all those topics you talked about, what is your second book going to be about? Is it going to be a follow-on, or is it going to be a separate but maybe adjacent topic? Because there was a lot there that we covered, and like I think
so it's all of that, but applied to our lives as individuals. How does this change how we live life morally, like behaviorally? Do we have like free will? Do we have our own agency or autonomy? How does this affect society? Does this give us a collective goal? If life is supposed to spread and in something like a planetary mind is forming, like are we moving towards a more integrated state? And is that inevitable? And how do we approach that state in the way that minimizes suffering and minimizes conflict? And so basically, I'm arguing that the biosphere is going towards, and in humanity, this more integrated collective state, such that something like, so I don't want to say a world government, and that scares people, and it should, but there's going to be some sort of globally coordinated state. But I think we need to be careful that this state that we're going towards. So for example, we don't want just one government ruling everybody. That would not be very much like an organism. An organism is very decentralized. You hear of this decentralization movement with like blockchain and like crypto. It's related to this because basically any sort of technology like the internet or blockchain technology where you have like peer-to-peer exchange of whatever, that is a mechanism for connecting all of the agents on Earth. So I'm saying that those technologies are part of this process. They emerge inevitably, but at the same time, you have this integrated superorganism. So you want resources to flow throughout the network and to be distributed to all parts of that superorganism.
Or the human body, I think the human body is a good example because like I have a heart cell that specializes in one thing, and then I have a brain cell that does its own thing. It's not one cell controlling it.
Exactly. So diversity is good, just like diversity in our body is good. We have all these different cell types that do all these different things.
Yeah.
So I think
good point.
The state of global coordination that we're going towards, we can still retain the identities of our nations and our cultures, but at the same time, we'll become more connected and more aware of each other and more empathic. And that this global state of coordination might not mean one global government, but it means that everything is connected in such a way that For example, we can respond to changes more quickly. Let's say we don't have a global government, but we're all coordinated to where we're all connected on social media, and it's easy to like send funds to any part of the earth that we need to. So let's say Russia invades Ukraine and everybody's connected by technology that they can't be censored on. Like you could have like a decentralized, like Facebook or some ultimate social media platform where everyone's connected and it's on blockchain technology, and a government can't take you down.
Right.
When Russia invades Ukraine, people could do things analogous to kind of these social media viral trends, like challenges or like relief funds, where most of the citizens of the world who think that an invasion is not the right thing can suddenly immediately put very severe pressures on the aggressor,
Right.
and stop that. So you can have a global coordination where it's not one small group, like one small government ruling everybody. It's that everybody's collectively coordinated in a way that you have a global superorganism, but it's not just this hive mind, or it's not just this centralized thing. It's actually the whole network is doing all of the work. All of the components, all of the agents in the network have a causal role to play.
Right. Not only that, but before that event of the invasion, the network was neutral to the invasion because there was no invasion, so they didn't have a thought about the invasion. And then opinions and resources fluctuated and weighted the balance towards, hey, stop that. And then that was, yeah. So I see.
Yeah, and so that's how it would happen, and we kind of see that today. I mean, there is that kind of dynamic, but it's like, and so that was, we were able to get a lot of relief to Ukrainians who weren't part of the war, civilians. And there's a lot of complexities if you want to talk about like, oh, who's right or wrong, like what led to that.
Yeah.
Was Ukraine like, was this expansion of NATO that Russia had to push back on for their, sovereignty or whatever. So that's a more complicated discussion.
Right.
But we could have the idea, we could all agree on the fact that there are civilians in this place.
Yeah.
They're living in their home, and then they're being invaded and they're being bombed, and like that is wrong, and we can stop that. So there's going to be tons of discussion around what's right or wrong to do, but our response time is going to be a lot quicker when we're all connected and we're all have the same mindset that, okay, we're part of this global superorganism. And that, because what I see in the US is I see most of the people were against that invasion and wanted to do things, and people donated, and everyone was like, celebrities, influencers, they were talking about it, regular people were posting about it, but it wasn't like we could exercise this causal power, like this immediate change that we could do if we started to build like an infrastructure that would allow us to. And this is how I think, crypto, I think is going to become more and more important, because, for example, we can just, and people use Bitcoin for this reason, you can send money to other nations across, borders, basically far quicker. So I think that's part of this. So what the second book that I'm working on right now, proposal for, because my publisher asked for one. And so, it's definitely happening. And it's going to be what I write about on the Road to Omega Substack, my Substack as well. That's really all about this.
Nice.
Is that if this understanding of the evolutionary process is correct, we're on an inevitable trajectory towards an integrated global superorganism that is aspiring to get off the planet, because that's what we have to do to survive. It may not be the most important thing right now. There can be a lot of discussion over that, but there is this tendency, there is this logic and kind of large scale determinism to the evolutionary process. But there's also all this freedom, because there is randomness in nature, like quantum randomness, and then there's chaotic phenomena where things are unpredictable. So what I'm saying is things are unpredictable enough to where our agency matters. And in the old view, if you thought things were completely deterministic, we didn't have any agency. So realizing that you have agency kind of empowers us to take the future into our own control. I'm
Right.
saying it's a little bit confusing because I'm saying there's kind of a destiny to the process, but nothing is outlined in stone. The future is open, and it's what we make of it. And that
Right.
we need to use these ideas to think about how can a system with all these agents that have to live on the same planet, how can we minimize conflict? How
Yeah.
can we align our interests? How
Yeah.
can we align our ideologies? And if this scientific theory of the universe is right, it would bring a lot more common ground between religious and atheists, and maybe right wing and left wing people, because it says, okay, there seems to be this meaning and purpose in nature. There really is a reason that life should try to continue to persist. We have this potential cosmic influence where we can change the fate of the entire universe.
Yep.
And we can use principles from complexity science and cybernetics, which is kind of the science of self-regulating systems, because we maintain ourselves through these like feedback loops. So our body's always doing this, like with homeostasis, like maintaining our physiological balance and body temperature. The network of humans is also a complex adaptive system that's maintaining this balance. But it goes through these cycles where things do get chaotic, and then these are these transition points. And if we change our mindset and we start to have an awareness that we're part of this larger system, it will change the dynamics of our behavior, and that change in behavior will propagate through the whole social system, and you'll see a change in the dynamics of the collective, and it'll bring us to a state of higher order and harmony.
The collective that you mentioned is definitely real. And I think what happens when there's when there are many organisms who evolve from a genesis organism on a planet, and there's an intelligent organism that takes precedent, I think that intelligent organism becomes a tribal. There's, of course, the incentive of the individual, myself, but then there's the incentive of the tribe. And I think those are separate and real things. And I think the incentive of the tribe, in this case, humanity on Earth, is like definitely to propagate into the universe, because we've already figured out Earth. We've done Earth. It's time to move on. And the incentive of the tribe exists in nature. It's tough to see in things like tigers or lions, but it's easy to see in insects such as bees and ants and even prey animals. For instance, an individual bee will gladly kill itself and to attack somebody who's threatening the queen of the hive. And so it exists, but also like that bee and myself, like I want to propagate, that bee wants to propagate if it can, the ant wants to propagate, but also it does care about the tribe. So it's a very interesting thing about that. And I do think there's a flow, and there is a flow of that side of humanity that's definitely happening.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to talk about tribalism and tribes, because it's kind of ironic. So what a tribe is, well, you have tribes before worldviews and religions emerged, but once those things emerged, you could have civilization and society. So that was a big part of basically what a religion or a worldview is, and it could be like a political ideology or something. Right. It's like it's a strategy for collective survival. It's a way of seeing the world and a set of beliefs that everyone kind of agrees upon, because it allows for a social structure, and it kind of creates a division of labor, and it kind of creates a coherence and a harmony. Yeah. So we need worldviews because they bind us together and they bring us together and form a collective. But it's kind of ironic that the thing that brings us together into these larger tribes, right, are the very same thing that divides us, because then you have these collectives where you had this belief system that united people. You have them emerging on different places on the planet, and then they're going to be different. So then, right, so it's equivalent to like a worldview is kind of like the DNA, the genome of an organism. It's kind of like everyone's strategy for survival. And when you have people with different worldviews and different tribes, they're going to be kind of like competing organisms. They're because the worldview is what gives them a sense of purpose and explains reality for them. And if someone has a differing worldview, it's a threat to your worldview and way of life. So my hope is that what this scientific worldview could do is align the interests of the worldviews and say, hey, you know, science is no longer this thing that's opposed to religion. There's actually meaning and purpose in nature. I might not buy all of the things that you say about, you know, your creator or the rules, you know, of how people should live, but we can agree on that there does seem to be like purpose and meaning, and that we're part of something larger. Now we need to start understanding how we can align our interests. So, and I think a lot of the ideas from religion, like, are things that scientists and people who used to call themselves atheists should take up and be like, oh, there really is a benefit to seeing yourself as someone who has a purpose.
Just to be clear, do you prescribe to a certain religion just to influence? I think that'll help the audience with like.
Okay, yeah. So the way I see it, religion is a product of humans trying to understand this order in the world that they see that led to life, and this kind of explanation of why we're here and what our meaning and purpose is.
Keyword try. Yeah. For me, at least. Yeah.
So I think people need to understand that religion is like an attempt to make sense of it all.
Yep.
But that these are very, you know, perfectly good philosophical theories about existence, like Taoism, this idea that there's these opposing forces and that, you know, they achieve this balance. You could think of like order and disorder, like being these two forces that together create complexity. This idea from Christian theology that there's sort of this destiny, there's this sort of trajectory, that there's this meaning for life, but we also have free will. We're also agents. There's also some randomness that allows for us to actually exercise agency in the world. I think a lot of these ideas are important. They haven't been emphasized in science. These new sciences of complexity and information are showing that those ideas were probably mostly right, and that it's completely a bad idea to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what I'd like to see is something like a cosmic religion, a sort of religion 2.0, where we go through all the religions and we say, what are the universal features of these religions? Because if there are ideas that are shared throughout a bunch of these, those are probably adaptive and probably converging on truth. And what are all of the things that have practical utility in these religions?
Right.
Holidays, for example. I think like Christmas, like it's like something we need in like a cold, like it's like winter and like everything is like dead outside, and we have this holiday that where everything's like magical and we get together, and you know, it's really family oriented. So I think it's sort of a meta-modernism. It's like there was like pre-modernism, which is before we had like science, we had all these religions, then we have modernism, is like the scientific enlightenment. Then postmodernism started to be critical and wondered like whether even the scientific view is right. Everything's are all constructs. This is a return to the idea that maybe there is some narrative to nature, some grand purpose to it all. And we should actually look at all of the belief systems that have come before, because they were a result of humans adapting to their circumstances, and pick out all of the things from those belief systems that allow us to live optimally today.
Right. And I think that's what your second book is kind of getting ready to touch on, which is great.
Yeah, so it will have a self-help component. It will basically say, look, we're these organisms that have models of the world. We've modeled the world around us because we need a map of the world to survive in it. That model of the world is what consciousness is. It's a sort of simulation of reality, but we're also part of this process where we are these agents that are evolving towards a higher intelligence. And so we're part of a story that gives us a purpose, but it also is really practical in all these ways. It goes, okay, so you have a belief system, you have a model of the world. Are you sure it's accurately reflecting reality? Are you updating your model when new evidence comes in, or are you being ideological and cutting yourself off to facts about nature?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of uses all these principles for complexity science to tell you how you should live your life, and
Yep.
also how we can optimize the design of our social and political and economic systems based on the fact that we're these agents and we're all interconnected. So yeah.
Nice. When can we expect that book to be out?
Probably not for like a year and a half or 2 years, but on my Substack Road to Omega, which is about this, and Omega refers to this idea of this Omega point, this state of maximal complexity that the biosphere is moving towards, that the universe as a whole may be moving towards, that should be our goal. So everything that is going to be in the next book in a rough form is going to come out in different posts. Yeah. So.
Well, we'll have to have you on after that's released to talk more about more stuff. We didn't hit on consciousness, which we will, I think, in the next episode if you want to come back on. But
or
Bobby,
psychedelics.
Yeah, psychedelics as well. But no, Bobby, thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate it so much. And
yeah, thanks a lot, Taylor. This is a lot of fun. Great.